No voice in our heads but the maw. To many peoples of the Warhammer Fantasy world, ogres have always been very curious creatures. They live for fighting and eating and fighting. A simple life, but to them, it is a good life. And who doesn't want to enjoy themselves when the world they live in is full of monstrosities and carnage? The origins of the ogres are rather unclear, as ogre society isn't known for writing down, well, just about anything. In fact, barely any ogres can either read or write, and their history gets passed down from generation to generation through the spoken word of tales. Tales of which often get distorted as it gets passed down from one mouth to another. To an ogre, history means their last meal, and ancient history is the feast before that. They are far more concerned with obtaining their next meal than debating how and why they came to be. There has been much debate by the more sophisticated races of the Warhammer world as to the true origins of the ogres, as such knowledge could hold many secrets that are built into the fabric of the world itself. Elven loremasters believe that the Old Ones, the mysterious beings who shaped so many of the creatures that walk the world, made the ogres to join the fight against the rising powers of chaos. However, the elves do theorize that quite a bit was left unfinished with the race when the polar gates collapsed, ushering in a tide of chaos powers to the world. To the elves, this explains the rude and intolerably vulgar nature of the ogres, and hence the graceful rulers of Ulthuan generally disdain them as a lowly and dim-witted race. Human scholars, led by the strangely prophetic imperial philosopher Bertsche of Null, believe that the ogres are close kindred to the race of halflings, perhaps coming from some common stock, but somewhere in time splitting into two divergent species, perhaps some foul mutation of some sort. There are many similarities. Both races are resistant to the effects of chaos, both have a comparable and all-consuming need to search out their next meal, and both bear unusual behavioral traits. For the ogres, they need to smash and eat everything. For halflings, the compulsion to swipe anything not nailed down. It is important to note here that while the ogres are naturally resistant to the effects of chaos, they are not immune to it. They are able to be blessed by chaotic mutations, although most will not give it much attention. Some of them even believe it is a blessing from their own deities rather than chaos. But let us not get too ahead of ourselves, as there is much to talk about. Large and loud, ogres are surely the race that was built for the Warhammer world. With warfare being so constant, it's not hard to think that these large, brutal creatures would not live in this world as their personal paradise. Many races look to the ogres with awe, as there are accounts of ogre warriors flattening chaos warriors with little trouble, or swatting an attacker away as if he were a fly. Nearly twice as tall and several times as wide as a normal man, their presence on the battlefield demands both respect and fear. Ogres are undeniably fat, but underneath all that blubber resides massive slabs of pure muscle. Their thick arms end in great ham-fisted weapons that wield large clubs with lethal ease. An ogre's legs are stout and tireless, all the better to carry such lumpen frame. With thick skin as resilient as cured leather, ogres can survive cold environments and are extremely tough, able to shrug off minor wounds. For this reason, only the richest and most elite ogre bother with armor beyond their gut plates, and instead stride to battle bare-chested. It is common amongst many tribes to tattoo themselves or daub themselves with war paint, although ogres are not hygienic in the least. It is hard to distinguish what is tribal marking and what is post-dinner gristle. What people usually notice first about the ogre, however, is its stomach. Ogres are extremely proud of their large stomachs, for it not only houses their innards, but is also a status symbol. A large stomach within ogre society means status, power, and a good eater. For that, nearly all ogres will actively seek to protect their stomachs with a large, circular gut plate. These are usually made of metal beaten into shape, but poor ogres are known to use hide skins, cast of cartwheels, and even some made of bone. Of course, anyone fighting an ogre directly would need to be quick to hit their stomach and make sure that they can land a fatal blow, or if an ogre takes a hit to an exposed stomach and they survive, the assailant will be beaten to a bloody pulp before being ripped to shreds and later eaten. You see, ogres are very strong, and when they are mad, they're even stronger. A lone ogre is a force to be reckoned with, able to take down a dozen men in a fight by himself without too much of a problem. A dozen ogres can easily overpower defenders of a town, level a majority of the buildings, and eat any animals and people should the ogres be hungry enough. An army of ogres, well, that is fear incarnate. Each ogre regiment is a sweaty, bellowing mass that builds up fearsome momentum that slams home like a ton of bricks. An army is made up of many such regiments, and it hits like an avalanche, a great, sweeping wave of crushing destruction. And ogres do not stomp to war by themselves, they bring with them lumbering cave creatures, hairy and long-tusked monsters from the wild mountains, and all manner of ferocious beasts. We have already mentioned that ogres are large, so simply imagine the size of the beast that ogres use as beasts of burden and mounts. Now the reason as to why ogres are known to enjoy war is rather simple. They are, if you can believe it or not, scavengers. Ogres will happily go to war with anyone either by their own accord or by selling their services, and normally, other than the usual price of food they will ask, or better yet said demand, they also ask and say demand again that they have the first pick of the spoils. Corpses, animals, weapons, all are of interest to the ogres, and who would be the idiot to deny them? The scrap found often bashed together with other pieces in an effort to make new weaponry. Nobody said they were ever smart. Ogres are restless creatures, and their tribes are nomadic, ready to move camp at the drop of a well-gnawed bone. Ogres often wander far from their homelands, and when their armies are on the move, they leave behind them a trail of wreckage and little else. The great crump, crump, crump sound of an ogre army on the march is not a welcome one, for they will attack and plunder any settlement they come across. In this manner, armies resupply on the move, consuming any who are foolish enough to stay and defend their homes, and then devouring all the livestock and anything else that looks vaguely edible. Any meat not devoured immediately is carried off, so ogres and their enormous war beasts are often seen with huge haunches of meat and unplucked rib cages tied to their bodies. As dangerous as a tribe on the march is, a halted tribe is even worse. Ogres traveling throughout the more civilized world will set up camp whenever they are bored of moving. Your town doesn't have to be near an ogre camp to know of their presence. Even if the camp is many leagues away, you'll certainly hear them. The sounds of infighting, crude construction, and flatulence will ring. In most cases, the ogres will settle down for a while and shortly move on after, but locally, the damage would have been done, and this means that either to the land or to the local populace. Their destructive nature would see farmland destroyed and rivers tainted. Even worse so, they will demand any locals pay tithe either under guise of protection or just outright because they want money and food. In most cases, the locals will simply pay unless they want bloodshed. But now that we have been introduced to the ogres themselves, it is time to learn about their history, for we can go back thousands of years, thankfully due to Cathayan knowledge. The majority of the ogres lived on the land to the far east, bordering the lands of Grand Imperial Cathay, sweeping steppes with grassland as far as the eye could see. Here the ogres thrived and multiplied, a simple existence before their gunpowder-based warfare that we know of today. It is said that ogres learned the secret of fire and basic metalworking from their neighbors in Cathay, and that there were no conflicts along their shared border. Peace, but only for a time. As more and more tribes stalked the steppes for food, it was only a matter of time before ogre raids entered into Cathay, and some ogres preyed upon their neighbors, even acquiring a preference for Cathayan flesh. With the peaceful relations eroding away, the Celestial Dragon Emperor of the Imperial Palace of Cathay changed his opinion of the ogres. They were becoming a threat, and not just to his people, but to his plans as a whole. By Cathayan magic, a light appeared in the sky. At first, it was visible only at night, but with each passing day, the object grew brighter until it shone like a second sun. At night, the blazing orb grew more luminous until it eclipsed the light of the twin moons. A sickly green light shone as the comet daily grew closer, and fanciful observers claimed that the new celestial body had a face, or more accurately, a mouth. Were this by Cathayan intention or not is unknown, but many people believe the original comet had been replaced by the Changer of Ways, Tzeentch, as he had been actively seeking a way to disrupt Grand Cathay. If the original comet had somehow been switched with a chunk of the Warpstone Moon or not is unknown, but it is heavily implied that it was by the Changer of Ways. The comet crashed into the Ogres' homeland with a force felt throughout the entire world. It is said that almost the entire population of the Ogres had been wiped out by just the impact. And firestorms rampaged throughout the grasslands, killing anything that was too slow to escape the roaring flames. The once vital plains were reduced to a searing desert of howling sandstorms and toxic wastes, with many Imperial scholars believing that this desert is the exact Warpstone Desert that borders Grand Cathay. The grasslands were gone, the beast herds were dead, and there was nothing in this wasteland to provide nourishment. So the remaining ogres soon fell to starvation. Cannibalism quickly set in, and an unnatural hunger gnawed away at the bellies of the once full ogres. To the ogres, it seemed that a vengeful deity had fallen upon them, consuming all before it. A great and terrible maw that existed purely to feed. Thus, the insatiable and merciless god of the ogres, the Great Maw, was born. The remaining ogres now became desperate as their once home of fertile lands, which teemed with life, now a barren wasteland devoid of resources, could not satiate their hunger. The strong survived on the bodies of the weak, but they needed to move quickly, lest the ogres be wiped out from the world. They would have travelled east into the lands of Grand Cathay, but a great cloud of poisonous vapours hung over the comet's wake, blocking all eastern routes towards Cathay, so the ogres were forced to travel into the unexplored west. In truth, this is probably the best thing that could have happened to them, as if they would have moved into Grand Cathay directly, the Celestial Dragon Emperor would have marched his forces to meet the ogres and wipe them out from the history of this world. Now, before we look to the events that happened to the west, we must first look to the events regarding the ogres and the Great Maw, and how they came to see it as their new deity. Ogre legend tells of Groff Onefinger, a prophet among his kind, who, before departing the old lands, dared to lead his tribe on a journey across the deadly desert to look upon and offer sacrifice to this new and powerful god. It was no easy matter travelling to the collision site. Hunger, flesh-tearing cyclones, and nameless monsters plagued Groff and his tribe. As they neared the impact of the zone, the fierce winds suddenly changed. Instead of swirling aimlessly, the winds now rushed inwards towards the crater's hole. So strong was that pull that the ogres had to fight for every step, lest the intake suck them into the great pit. When Groff and his tribe reached the edge, hunkering down and gripping the edge for dear life, what they saw was astounding, and has since been depicted on countless gut plates and banners, and is forever etched into the consciousness of the ogre race. The gaping hole that stretched before Groff was immense, like some newly grown inland sea, except there was no water within, only empty and plummeting blackness. Its edge was filled with ridge upon ridge of jagged teeth and rippling, convulsing muscle that stretched down into a vast nothingness. Here was a gullet so bottomless it could swallow the ogre race into oblivion and still hunger for more. Groff and some survivors returned with tales that filled the remaining ogres with awe. Thousands of years have since passed, but many ogres still follow the footsteps of Groff. For the Great Maw exists there still, a vile, pulsing god visited upon the world by the vengeful heavens. Not all who take the journey return, for the trip is deadly. Where once vast herds grazed, now giant razor-limbed insects lurk, waiting to burst from under the wasted land to attack unwary prey. Large carrion birds ride high on the thermals above, keen eyes searching for their next meal. Most deadly, however, of all is the Great Maw itself, for it still hungers. The presence of the Great Maw rives in the minds of all ogres, beckoning them to return, to stand upon that mighty precipice. So ogres have become a restless race, forever seeking to escape from that whisper in the back of their minds that pulls them back to their gluttonous yet insatiable god. Some ogres, those that have travelled around the globe, even claim that there is another maw in the ocean, on the far side of the world, a vast, fanged whirlpool that devours any ships that stray too close. Yet no distance is great enough to escape the pull and lure of the Great Maw. No ritual or feast can fully appease its eternal appetite. And, whilst it hungers still, its barbarous sons will feed and feed and feed until they consume the world. The remaining ogres that had moved west travelled to the mountain peaks, where an ancient race of giants lived. Mountain ranges unrivaled by any others, teeming with life of great beasts, possibly untouched by the will of the Old Ones themselves when they first arrived. A land that was dangerous, but they would soon dominate should they settle. As they travelled up the mountainsides, many ogres would be lost to the harsh weather and great beasts, but this was no concern to the ogres. The weak would fall, so the strong would survive, and such matters would only serve to make the ogres stronger than before. Further and further they pushed, until the first peaks came to reach. Mountaintops that were permanently covered in mists, but once that cloud cover was breached, it could be seen that those mighty mountains soared higher still, surely standing as the highest and steepest range in the world. There, far above the cloud, the ogres first observed the Sky Titans and their vast herds. The Sky Titans were an ancient race, much taller and far more intelligent than the giants of today. The Sky Titans had hewn vast fortresses in the mountains themselves, blunt, megalithic citadels that overlooked the shimmering seas of clouds, pierced by great islands of rock on which stood other castles. Hermetic by nature, the Sky Titans had long ago forgotten about the other races of the world, for they were content in their reclusive realm, hidden from others by the sheer inaccessible nature of the peaks, and their shrouding cover of cloud. The Sky Titans rarely descended before the tree line, save only to tend their herds of cave beasts and enormous mammoths. It was these gargantuan beasts that the ogres first encountered, and the ravenous ogres at first thought that they had reached some golden realm of plenty, a veritable promised land of red meat, so to speak. They were, however, utterly unprepared for herd animals as fierce and dangerous as these, and many ogres found that instead of a gluttonous feast, they were instead gored by mighty tusks, or stomped to death beneath thunderous hooves. The ogres swiftly learned that the only way to pull down such creatures was to work together, separating a single beast from the pack, much as they had observed the giant wolves hunting the snowy slopes. The Sky Titans had obviously begun to notice this new strange threat emerging, after many years undisturbed war had come to their peaks, and thus had begun the event known as the War in the Sky. The Sky Titans met the ogres with full force, but ultimately, while far larger than the ogres, they were outnumbered by the hundreds. The ogres, for the first time in a while, had all their tribes united to combat this threat. Unfortunately for the Sky Titans, they were not united, their various castles too far from each other to provide support while the ogres laid siege. As the ogres rampaged further into the mountain range, they noticed that not only did the mountains tower ever taller, but that the Sky Titans also grew larger and larger. The most ancient of that long-lived race grew to enormous sizes. Yet, over the ages of their lives, the Sky Titans became ever more sedentary, until finally becoming like the mountains themselves. Many ogres believed that the final peaks they climbed in the ancient giant lands were not mountains at all, but instead the eldest of the Sky Titans, now permanently enthroned into living stone. If this was so, they were the last of their kind, for the ogres could find no more, and they reckoned that they had devoured their entire race down to the last fingerbone. There was a rumor of the final few Sky Titans unfettering their mountaintop and sailing away on the clouds. But if this were true, none could say to where the refugees fled, or if they ever arrived there safely. With the Sky Titans gone, the Ogres of course looted their castles. Many of their weaponry, such as the famed Iron Blaster, now fell towards Ogre hands. And this is of course when we start to see Ogres picking up black powder weaponry and using it against their enemies. For a time, the Ogres enjoyed their newly conquered lands, but our story does not end here. You see, the poisonous gases that had been unleashed on the arrival of the Great Moor had begun to travel, and as we know, gas travels up. Paired with the effects of living on such a high altitude, the Ogres began to fall ill and knew that they must travel once more or else they will find their end. Over the centuries, the Ogres that stayed living amongst the dust-tainted sky castles regressed in nature until they became feral and bestial. They evolved white shaggy fur and long talons and a new affinity for the harsh cold in which they lived. Thus was the mountaintop race of Yetis born, and although rare, these abominable creatures have spread to many other high places of the world where they prey on all those who dare those frosty realms. Further west did the majority of the Ogres travel, into the lands now known as the Mountains of Mourn, where the air was thicker, the land was more hospitable, and most importantly, free of the chaotic cloud that would have been the end of their race. Here there were dwarfs, greenskins and skaven they could fight, eat and steal from. It was safer, and it would serve as a base for the foundation of the Ogre Kingdoms. The grand majority of the Ogres would make their home in the Mountains of Mourn. In fact, even Ogre tribes, who may have been gone for centuries, still refer it to their homeland. They have made a home for themselves here, and it is likely that they have forgotten most of their past prior to their arrival over the years. It is not a safe land by any stretch of the word. In fact, the only reason why Ogres live here so happily is because they are likely one of the very few races that could do so, the raw strength and stupidity being their strongest tools among the large creatures that roam here. But now it brings us to the most recent day, as not much has really changed for the Ogres over the years since they settled in the Mountains of Mourn. They have since adopted a second deity known as the Firemouth, a rather large and powerful volcano settled within the centre of the Mountains of Mourn itself. But now the Ogres themselves live as peacefully in their own sense as they can. They travel around the Mountains of Mourn, hunting beasts in their nomadic way, and will often fight amongst other tribes. In fact, many Ogres look towards a future coming of an Over-Tyrant. An Ogre to unite all other Ogre tribes and lead them to greatness as they devour the world in the name of the Great Moor, hoping that that will satiate its hunger and they will finally see peace from the voice within. In most cases, any other Ogre tribes not within the Mountains of Mourn seek to travel around the world, earning their fortune as mercenaries, often known as man-eaters. But as you can tell that the Ogres themselves are very random in nature, and you cannot predict the moment an Ogre will turn on you, even if you are paying it, as it could turn around and decide that you look tastier than the enemy you've asked it to fight. Or the enemy has presented an even better offer, which does happen. But as it stands, this was the story of the Ogre Kingdoms and how they came to be under the Mountains of Mourn. Keep in mind that obviously accounts do vary when it comes to different editions, but this was based on the 8th edition book mostly of Warhammer Fantasy Battles. There was always a common misconception to those who might not be too familiar with the tabletop that obviously the Ogres are more of a happy-go-lucky race, but in fact they have maddening whispers in the back of their head, which makes their existence even more grim than most people would suspect. There's really not a lot of information regarding the Great Moor itself and why it does this, but hopefully in the future Games Workshop will be more willing to, especially now that we of course have the Old World on the way. So that'd be kind of cool if we got a little bit more information as to what exactly makes the Great Moor tick, which they have tried to do every so often when it comes to, say for example, other gods like Sigmar, Tzeentch, Slaanesh, Nurgle, even some minor gods too like Cain. They always tried to bring as much representation as possible, but since the Ogres were technically a really new race in terms of tabletop, they just didn't have a lot of time to get fleshed out properly. But what do you think about the Ogre Kingdoms? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start a bit of a discussion. But with that, my friends, we've come to the end of our video. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, might I suggest giving the video a like, or even subscribing to the channel, as it really does help us out. In the description section below are various links to different social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Discord. Also in the description section is an affiliate link with Element Games where you could buy loads of hobby-based products, not just Warhammer, for 10 to 25% off. Making a purchase using that link and also our special code, which is also in the description, supports the channel at no extra cost to you, which we think is rather cool. A big thank you to our patrons. Your support means the world to us. It's amazing that people want to help a small channel like us grow and get to a higher level of content. A big thank you to Gibraltar LUSC, Ryan Bertsche, Andrew Prince, and Ogre for subscribing to us at our Fane level. You guys are super cool. And a big thank you to Edward Yule, VSVasan, Aaron Whitman, and Shaggy for subscribing to us at our King level. Honestly, we can't thank you all enough. And lastly, a big thank you to all of you for liking, sharing, and commenting on these videos. Honestly, it's because of you guys that the channel's been growing at such a great pace lately, so we can't thank you all enough. But with that, my friends, thank you so much for watching once again, and we shall see you all again very, very soon. Have a good day.